Alara had always known her life would be bound by duty, but never in her deepest fears had she imagined this. At 20, she stood before the gates of the palace crypt, her black silk gown trailing behind her like a shadow. The night air was sharp and cold, and the moon hung like a pale witness to her fate. Within these walls, she was to marry a king who no longer breathed a ruler, whose power still whispered through the stone corridors, even in death. The courtiers lined the halls, their faces pale and still, watching her approach. Some wore curiosity in their eyes, others suspicion. Whispers trailed behind her like cobwebs. The young bride of the dead king. What madness has brought this to pass? But Alara could not meet their eyes. Her heart beat like a war drum against her chest, each step echoing through the cavernous space. At the center of the crypt, the Alpha King lay upon his obsidian throne. His body, dressed in ceremonial armor blackened with age and tarnished with gold, seemed almost untouched by decay. The silver clasp at his neck glinted in the torchlight, and his hands rested neatly over his chest, fingers interlaced as if in prayer. There was a stillness about him that made her shiver, a stillness that was almost, but not quite, alive. The high priest, draped in crimson robes, motioned her forward. "Alara, of House Vielen," he intoned, his voice carrying through the hollow stone. "You are bound by law and blood to take this king as your husband. Though he has passed beyond the world of the living, his power remains. Your touch, your vow, shall awaken him in spirit and bind your fates together." Alara swallowed hard. The words felt strange, heavy with magic and fear. Her fingers trembled as she stepped closer, the heat of the torches doing little to warm her icy limbs. Around her, the shadows seemed to stretch, twisting along the walls as if they were alive. She tried to remind herself this was tradition, law, nothing more. But the air itself carried a warning she could not name. She reached the throne, bowing her head, and studied the king's face. In life, he had been handsome, with sharp features and eyes that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Now, death had softened nothing. His jaw was firm, lips pale and unmoving, his hair dark as the night sky. Yet there was something beneath that stillness, a faint hum in the air around him, that made her skin prickle. "Place your hand upon him," the priest instructed, voice softer now, almost a whisper meant only for her. Alara hesitated. The world seemed to hold its breath. She could feel the weight of the eyes of the court upon her, the power of the king in the stone beneath her fingers. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her hand and let her palm brush against his cold chest. At first, nothing happened. Her fingers froze as she pressed gently, and the cold that seeped into her skin made her gasp. The court remained silent, watching, waiting, each heartbeat echoing in her ears. Then, a faint shiver ran through the king's hand. His fingers twitched, almost imperceptibly, and a strange warmth coursed through her palm. A pulse like a heartbeat that should not exist. Ilara's eyes widened. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be? The priest's lips moved in silent prayer. Whispers rose among the courtiers, and some stepped back, startled. The king's chest moved slightly, as if he had drawn a single, fragile breath. The power of the dead king pressed on her senses, strength, authority, and a shadow of something darker. Something that had no name. She felt her own heart quicken. A strange pull toward him that frightened her. She had never known such fear and fascination in the same instant. The silence of the crypt deepened, as if the walls themselves waited for what would come next. "Alara," the priest intoned, "speak your vow." Her lips trembled as she tried to form the words. I vow to honor, to protect, and to stand with you, even in life and beyond." The moment her words left her lips, the twitch in the king's fingers became a stronger movement. His eyes, closed until now, shifted slightly beneath their lids, as though sensing her presence. A faint spark of life or something that resembled life flashed through them. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy she could feel pressing on her skin. The court gasped. Some of the older nobles muttered prayers under their breath. Others stared in fear. But Elara could not look away. She felt as though the very soul of the king reached for her, testing her resolve, seeking something she could not name. For a moment, terror threatened to overwhelm her. What had she done? Had she awakened something that should have remained at rest? Yet another emotion tugged at her heart, a strange, curious longing. She could not explain why she felt drawn to him, why the thought of letting go made her chest ache. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a low, hollow sound, as if the crypt itself were speaking. The shadows along the walls seemed to twist and shift, curling toward her as if alive. She stepped back, but her hand remained on his chest, unwilling to release the strange connection that had formed. Elara. The word was not spoken by the priest or the nobles. It was faint, almost a whisper carried on the cold air. She looked down at the king's face, but his lips did not move, and yet she had heard it clearly, as if the sound had come from the depths of her own mind. Her heart pounded. Something stirred beneath the surface of death, a consciousness, perhaps, or a power that refused to be bound. She could not tell whether it was fear, awe, or something far more dangerous that coursed through her veins. A sudden cold wind swept through the crypt, extinguishing some of the torches and throwing the shadows into sharp relief. The court murmured in fear, but Elara could not take her eyes from him. The twitching of his fingers became more deliberate, more purposeful, and then, just as quickly, he went still again. The priest's voice cut through the tension. The bond has begun. Fear not, for she is chosen. Only she may awaken him fully. Only she may guide him back to life. Elara felt a shiver run through her. The words were meant to reassure, but they did little to calm the storm raging inside her. She had married a corpse, yet she was certain now that the corpse was no longer simply dead. There was a life, fragile and dangerous, waiting beneath the surface. As the ceremony concluded, the courtiers filed out of the crypt, murmuring and whispering, leaving Elara alone with the king. The high priest lingered for a moment, bowing deeply. "You must guard him," he said softly, "not only from enemies, but from the darkness that follows him. Even death leaves shadows behind." Alone, Elara could hear the faintest of movements, the subtle shift of armor, the almost imperceptible twitch of a finger. She swallowed hard, her hand still resting upon his chest, feeling the pulse of something that should not exist. The moonlight fell across his face, and she could see the faintest glimmer of awareness in his eyes. He was not fully awake, but he was no longer merely a corpse. And with that, a chill ran down her spine. What had she done? And what would come next? Elara realized that the night had only just begun. In awakening the Alpha King, she had stepped into a world of power, mystery, and danger. She was bound to him, not by choice, but by destiny. And as she stood in the crypt, the silence pressing against her like a living thing, she knew one undeniable truth. The dead king was stirring, and with him, a story of darkness, power, and longing was beginning. The shadows shifted again, curling around her like fingers reaching from the stone. She took a shaky breath, tightening her grip on the king's hand, and whispered to herself, "I will face whatever comes. Even death itself cannot break this bond." But even as she spoke, a faint spark of movement in the king's eyes made her realize that he had already begun to see her not just as the girl who married him, but as the one who had awoken him. And in that spark, Elara felt the weight of everything to come. A storm that would change both their lives forever. The crypt seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, time itself felt suspended. The Alpha King's eyes fluttered open fully, revealing a depth that was almost human, almost alive, and yet shadowed with a power that defied understanding. Elara's heart raced. This was only the beginning. The morning after the ceremony, the palace was silent in a way that felt unnatural. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, and servants hurried through the halls with hurried glances over their shoulders. But Alara could not think of them. She could think of only one thing: the Alpha King. In the private chamber where he had been moved after the crypt ceremony, he lay on a carved bed of dark oak, his armor removed but ceremonial robes still draped across him. The moonlight from the crypt had not followed him, but the faint pulse of life or something like it remained. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, a rhythm that made her chest ache with a mixture of fear and something deeper. "Elara," he whispered, his voice hoarse, low, and almost foreign. His eyes were open now, but they flickered like candlelight, sometimes alive with intelligence, sometimes shadowed by death. You brought me back." Elara knelt by his side, gripping her own hands tightly. I only followed the ceremony," she said, voice shaking. "I did what the priest told me. I did not mean to." He lifted a trembling hand, stopping her. "No. I feel it. Your touch. It is the tether. Without it, I cannot stay. You." His gaze met hers, and in that moment, she understood. He knew her, or at least he sensed her. Something in her presence held him to the world of the living. Fear mingled with a strange awe in her chest. "Then, I must stay near you?" she asked softly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he tried to sit up, only to falter and lean back. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if his body did not yet obey him fully. Elara rushed to steady him, and the contact sent an unexpected warmth through her hand. The bond between them was undeniable, yet dangerous. "You are stronger than you appear," he said finally, a shadow of a smile playing at his lips. "I can feel it. But this is only the beginning." Days passed, and the Alpha King's awakening continued in fits and starts. At times, he was lucid, commanding, almost human, in his thoughts and desires. At others, he was shadowed by fragments of death, a cold, sharp anger that made him flinch at the light, make threats he could not remember, and speak of memories he claimed were not his own. Elara watched him with a mixture of fascination and fear. Each day, her presence seemed to restore him, to make him more alive. But the more alive he became, the more dangerous he seemed. A king who had died and returned was no longer bound by the rules of ordinary men. His power stretched beyond mortal comprehension, and she realized that the palace, the kingdom, and perhaps even the world itself might bend to him if he chose. She began to notice subtle changes in the people around them. The courtiers treated her with cautious reverence, while others studied her with envy. She was no longer simply a young bride of a dead king. She had become a source of power, the link between life and death itself. One evening, as the sun bled red into the horizon, the king called her to the balcony overlooking the city. He stood, tall and imposing, though still fragile from his resurrection. "See them," he said, voice low and steady. "Do you understand what you have brought me back to?" Elara looked down at the streets below. Merchants moved quickly, citizens whispered prayers, and soldiers marched in perfect formation. All of them feared him, or they would, when his full power returned. "Why am I still here then?" she asked softly. "If you are dangerous, if you are not yet fully yourself, why do you keep me near?" The king turned to her, his gaze piercing and raw. "Because only you can hold me here. Without your courage, your touch, I would slip fully into the shadows. You have given me life again, Elara. You have made me more than a corpse. But it is not only I who am bound. You are tied to me now. Every moment, every choice you make, it shapes what I become." Ilara's heart raced. The responsibility was overwhelming. She was not just a bride. She was a guardian, a guide, and perhaps even a salvation for a being who straddled life and death. Yet beneath the weight of duty, she felt something stirring, a strange connection, an unspoken understanding that went beyond fear. As the days continued, the king began testing her. He would ask questions that pierced her understanding of the world, challenge her judgment, and watch her reactions with eyes that seemed to see into her very soul. She realized then that he was learning from her as much as she was learning from him. But the world outside their chambers did not wait. The king's rivals had not forgotten him in death. Whispers of rebellion, plots to seize the throne, and fears of the undead monarch spread through the palace like wildfire. Alara felt the weight of each secret glance and veiled warning. She began to understand that her role was not only to sustain him, but to protect him from enemies who might strike before he regained his full strength. One night, a messenger arrived in the dead of darkness, slipping a folded note into her hand. The ink was smeared, the words hastily written. "He is not yet whole. Danger approaches. Trust no one." Alara's fingers trembled as she read the words. Her eyes darted to the king, who was quietly observing her from across the room. "Do you know what this means?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "It means that those who feared me in life will act now that they think me weak. They believe I am still bound by death. They will be wrong." The tension between them grew. The king's shadowed past and his growing power pressed upon her like a storm. Yet, even as she feared him, she could not deny the pull she felt, an intimacy that grew in quiet moments, when he would reach for her hand, when he would study her face, searching for signs of loyalty and courage. Each touch, each glance, was a reminder of the bond they shared, a bond neither fully understood, but both could not escape. Then, one evening, a confrontation arrived that neither could ignore. In the palace gardens, under a sky streaked with storm clouds, a group of nobles approached with hidden weapons and veiled threats. "The king is not whole," one whispered. "We cannot allow this abomination to rule." The Alpha King stepped forward, tall and imposing despite his unfinished revival. Shadows seemed to gather around him, a subtle but undeniable manifestation of the power that still lingered from death. "I am the Alpha King," he declared, voice ringing like iron through the night. "And no one will take my throne while I still draw breath." Ilara stood beside him, hand resting lightly on his arm. The bond between them thrummed in the storm-laden air. She felt his pulse under her fingers, a pulse of life, of power, of something far greater than herself. She realized then that she was no longer merely a spectator in the world of kings and shadows. She was a player, bound to a man who had walked through death and returned stronger for it. The nobles hesitated, fear creeping into their eyes. Yet one among them, bolder than the rest, stepped forward with a sneer. "And if the shadows within you turn against us," he demanded, "will she, your bride, be enough to control the monster you've become?" The king's eyes flickered toward Alara, and in that glance, she saw both warning and protection. He would not let her fall. He would not let her be used as a pawn. And yet, the threat was real. The shadows that clung to him from death were unpredictable, untamed, and dangerous. As the wind howled through the garden, stirring the trees and tossing loose leaves into the air, Alara understood the full weight of her role. She had awakened a king, but in doing so, she had bound herself to a power that could devour her if she faltered. Fear, awe, and a strange longing mingled in her heart, and she realized that the journey ahead would test not only the Alpha King but herself in ways she could not yet imagine. The nobles finally backed away, whispering curses and promises of revenge. The storm broke, rain pattering against stone and foliage, washing the garden in silver light. The king's shadowed figure stood tall, the faint pulse of life strong beneath the surface, and Alara felt the unspoken truth settle between them. Their bond was more than ceremony, more than survival. It was connection, responsibility, and the first fragile stirrings of trust, and perhaps something deeper, though neither dared name it yet. "Alara," the king said quietly, voice carrying over the rain, "whatever comes next, we face it together. But be warned, those who watch us are patient. They wait for weakness, and in this world, weakness can be fatal." Alara nodded, gripping his hand firmly. The warmth of his pulse, the living thread that bound them, reassured her. "I will not let you fall." she whispered. I will stand with you. Always. And as the storm raged around them, a strange, unspoken understanding passed between them. Life had returned to death. Power had been awakened, and the world itself would soon bend to the consequences of their bond. The real struggle, the true dance of life, death, and love was only beginning. Days blurred into nights, as Alara and the Alpha King settled into an uneasy rhythm. He was stronger now, his movements more fluid, his mind clearer. Yet the shadows of his death clung to him, restless and unpredictable. Ilara had grown accustomed to the delicate balance of life and death that now defined their bond. Every touch, every word, seemed to tether him further to the living world and to her. Yet with power comes attention, and attention often carries danger. Rumors of the king's resurrection spread beyond the palace walls. Some whispered in awe, speaking of a man returned from death by a bride's courage. Others whispered in fear, claiming dark magic had bound a corpse to the world, and that such power could not remain unchecked. One morning, Alara found herself walking through the palace corridors, the echo of her steps bouncing off the stone walls. Servants and guards avoided her gaze, their fear barely concealed. She reached the king's chamber, to find him standing by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the city washed in soft light. But his expression was dark, restless. They are planning, he said without turning. Not all have accepted me. Not all have accepted you. Ilara approached cautiously, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know, she said softly. But we have survived this far. Together, we can face them. He turned then, his gaze intense. Together, he repeated, as if testing the word, tasting its weight. Yes, but trust is scarce. And betrayal. Betrayal can strike from the closest of allies. The warning was clear. Even now, those who had served him in life may not have welcomed his return. Ilara's stomach tightened at the thought. The court, with all its polished smiles and hidden daggers, was a dangerous place. And the more alive the king became, the more dangerous he was to those who sought to control or replace him. The next day, a feast was held in the main hall, a display of power and life meant to solidify the king's presence and remind the court that he was no longer bound by death. Ilara watched as nobles and generals offered their bows and whispered their cautious words. The king stood at the head of the table, regal and commanding despite the faint tremor in his hands. Yet even amid the ceremony, tension crackled in the air. A particular noble, Lord Varen, known for his ambition and cunning, lingered near the king's throne, his eyes flicking between Ilara and the king. There was calculation in his gaze, a quiet threat disguised beneath polite words and forced smiles. After the feast, as the guests filtered out, Varen approached Ilara. You wield power few understand, he said, voice smooth, almost honeyed. Be careful. The king, even alive, may not be safe from those who wish him gone. And you are tied to him. That tie may cost you everything. Ilara's grip tightened on her dress. I do not fear the king, she replied firmly. Nor do I fear what comes with him. Varen's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Ah, courage, or foolishness. Time will tell. He bowed and left, leaving a lingering sense of unease in his wake. That night, Ilara found the king pacing in the chamber. He watches, she said, recounting Varen's warning. He and others who seek to use us or destroy us. The king's gaze hardened. Let them watch. Let them whisper. Their fear will be their weakness. I am no longer their dead king, bound to shadows. I am alive. And with you, Ilara, I will stand. A quiet tension hung in the air. Ilara realized that her role was more than sustaining him. She was his partner in every sense. In battle, in politics, and in the fragile dance between life and death. But the shadows were not content to remain distant. That night, while the palace slept under a veil of silver moonlight. The king was seized by visions, fragments of his death and darker moments before. He cried out in the silence, the echoes bouncing through the stone corridors. Alara rushed to his side, placing a trembling hand on his chest. "Breathe," she whispered, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "I am here. You are alive. I'm Siev. Hupanavli Ning. I'm Si. I'm Si of what them. I'm Si of what them. I'm Si of what them." The king's eyes met hers, shadowed with fear and confusion. "I remember," he murmured, the words barely audible. "I remember pain, betrayal, the shadow. It wants me back." Alara pressed closer, offering strength through touch. "Then fight it. I am with you. Always." Hours passed before he calmed. The shadows receded slightly, but the king's face was pale, marked by the memory of a torment that refused to die. She understood then that resurrection was not a gift without cost. Each fragment of life he regained brought not only strength but also echoes of the darkness he had once known. Days later, the first true test of their bond arrived. A trusted courtier, someone who had once served the king faithfully, attempted to seize control of the throne while he slept. Alara, alerted by a quiet rustle and the sudden absence of guards, found herself in the throne room alone with the intruder. The man lunged at her, dagger raised. Alara's heart raced. She had no formal training, no experience in battle. Yet the bond with the king gave her courage she had never known. She grabbed a nearby candle holder and struck him with all her strength. The intruder staggered, then fled into the shadows of the palace, leaving only silence in his wake. The king arrived moments later, fully awake, fully aware. He observed her, his eyes a mixture of pride and concern. "You saved yourself," he said softly. "And yet, you risked so much." Alara's hands trembled. "I couldn't let him take you," she said, voice firm. "Not when you're not fully like this." He stepped closer, the shadows around him coiling faintly as if sensing his presence. "You saved more than me," he said quietly. "You saved us. Both. That is the bond between us. And yet, danger has only begun." The king's words were a reminder that the world outside their chamber was still treacherous. Shadows lingered not only in him but in the hearts of those around them. Every act of courage, every step taken, carried consequences. Alara understood now that the bond they shared was more than life and death. It was trust, loyalty, and the growing intimacy of two souls intertwined by fate. The next morning, a council of nobles gathered, demanding answers and pledges of loyalty. The king, once feared and now resurrected, stood at the center. His gaze swept the room, resting on each face with quiet authority. Alara stood beside him, her presence a visible reminder of the power that had brought him back from death. "Those who would betray me," the king said, voice resonant, "will find that life and death no longer serve only their designs. I am returned, and I will not be moved by fear or deceit." Some bowed, others remained stiff, but all knew the truth in his words. Yet beneath the polished veneer of loyalty, Alara sensed the currents of envy and ambition. They were like hidden predators, waiting for the right moment to strike. Later, as the council dispersed, the king turned to her. "You have been brave," he said, "and yet the shadows will test us again. Trust will be broken, alliances will fail, and the curse, it has not released its hold." Alara nodded, though her heart trembled. "Then we face it together," she whispered. He reached for her hand, their fingers entwining in a bond that felt stronger than steel, warmer than the fires that lit the palace halls. "Together," he said, and in that single word there was promise, warning, and a hint of something deeper, a connection neither fully understood, but neither could deny. As the day faded into night, A figure watched from the palace tower, hidden in shadows, eyes glinting with malice and intent. The observer whispered a single sentence carried on the wind. "They think they are safe. But the darkness is far from done." Ilara felt the chill, even from afar. A reminder that the world outside the chambers was no less dangerous than the shadows within. The bond she shared with the king had given him life, but it had also marked them both. Every step forward would bring new trials, new dangers, and the ever-present risk of betrayal. Yet despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she did not falter. She would stand with him, face the shadows, and walk the path of life and death together. For in that bond, she had found purpose and perhaps, in time, something far more profound. The Alpha King, now stronger and more alive than ever, stood beside her, unaware that their trials were only beginning. Outside, the unseen observer vanished into the night, leaving behind a sense of impending threat that neither the court nor the palace could yet comprehend. The shadows had grown restless. For nights, Ilara had sensed their presence, a whispering chill that lingered in the corridors and trembled in the air. The unseen observer from the council had not vanished, and now it became clear that danger would not wait. The palace itself seemed alive with tension, each stone vibrating with the echoes of power, betrayal, and unfinished business. Ilara stood at the edge of the grand balcony, watching the city glow under the setting sun. The Alpha King was beside her, tall and commanding, yet tempered by the fragility that had once bound him to death. His eyes, once haunted by shadow and memory, now held clarity, though still touched by the darkness he had survived. "They are coming," he said quietly, voice steady but low. "They think to challenge me, to challenge us. But they do not know what it means to face someone who has walked through death and returned." Ilara's hand brushed his arm, a gesture of courage and connection. "Then we face them together," she said. "Whatever comes, we will not falter." He nodded, a faint smile breaking through the shadowed intensity of his expression. "Together," he repeated. The first threat arrived as night fell. From the darkness of the palace's outer halls, figures emerged, cloaked and masked, moving with lethal precision. The Alpha King stepped forward, shadows bending around him like living things, his presence commanding the air itself. Ilara followed, heart steady though nerves thrummed, her hand never leaving his. The assailants struck with swift intent, but the king's power, fueled by life and the bond with Ilara, was unmatched. Shadows swirled around him, lifting, twisting, and striking in ways that defied comprehension. The attackers faltered, fear taking root as the strength of the resurrected monarch became clear. Ilara found herself beside him in the thick of the chaos. Though she carried no weapon, she did not hesitate. Her courage, her connection to the king, allowed her to anticipate danger, to move with purpose. She guided him where needed, warned him of unseen threats, and through her presence, he grew stronger. Their bond was more than life and death. It was trust, unspoken communication, and a shared resilience that no force could break. One of the attackers, bolder than the rest, lunged toward Ilara. Instinctively, the king moved faster than any human could, placing himself between her and the strike. Shadows enveloped the attacker, lifting him into the air before releasing him into the hall. Unconscious but alive, the king's eyes met Ilara's, and for a brief moment, vulnerability flashed in them, reminding her that beneath the power, he was still tethered, still fragile in ways the world could not see. When the hall fell silent, the remnants of the attackers retreating, Ilara and the king stood alone, breathing in the charged air. The danger was not fully gone, but they had survived together. "You are remarkable," he said softly, "not because you saved yourself, but because you chose to stand with me, to face the darkness without hesitation. That courage, it is rare, even among the living." Ilara's cheeks flushed, a mixture of pride and exhaustion. "I stand with you because I must," she said, "and because I cannot imagine facing this alone." He took her hand, lifting it gently. "Then, we are truly bound." he said. Not by ceremony, not by duty, but by choice, by courage and trust, and perhaps by something stronger still. The storm that had followed his resurrection seemed to ease, the palace settling into a quiet that was almost sacred. Yet even in the calm, the Alpha King knew the shadows were not fully gone. The curse that had bound him to death lingered, a whisper at the edge of consciousness, reminding him that the past could not simply be erased. Days passed as the king regained full strength. He walked the halls with confidence, commanded the court with authority, and faced those who had sought to betray him. Ilara remained close, her presence a stabilizing force. Together, they began to rebuild not only the monarchy, but the very perception of life and death within the kingdom. In quiet moments, away from the court and the palace, the two would speak of their fears, their pasts, and the strange path that had brought them together. The bond between them deepened beyond survival and duty. It was connection, understanding, and the subtle stirrings of affection that neither had expected. The king, once feared and untouchable, now revealed glimpses of tenderness and vulnerability. Ilara, once terrified and reluctant, discovered strength she had not known she possessed. Yet the final test awaited them. In the crypt beneath the palace, the darkness had gathered, coalescing into a monstrous form, a physical manifestation of the curse that had once held the king. It surged with anger, with the echoes of death, and with the power to consume both life and hope. Ilara knew she could not face this alone. "We face it together," she whispered, gripping the king's hand. He nodded, shadows coiling around his form, his eyes blazing with determination. "Together," he echoed. The battle was fierce. Shadows struck, twisted, and writhed. But the bond between life and death, between king and bride, held firm. Ilara's courage guided him, while his strength protected her. Each strike they faced, each moment of danger, strengthened their connection. And through that bond, they pushed the darkness back, step by step. Finally, at the heart of the crypt, the monstrous shadow paused, as if recognizing the power of their unity. The king, drawing upon his regained life and the tether that Ilara provided, confronted the shadow directly. "You have no hold over me," he declared, voice ringing like thunder in the stone chamber. "I am alive, and I choose to live, free of your chains." The shadow writhed, twisted, and then dissipated into nothingness, leaving only silence. The curse had been challenged, confronted, and finally, broken not by magic alone, but by courage, trust, and the bond between two souls. Ilara and the king stood together, breathing heavily, their hands still entwined. The crypt was quiet, the shadows gone, leaving only the two of them in the stillness of victory. "You did this," the king said softly, turning to her. "Not I. Your courage, your heart. It saved me, and perhaps even the kingdom." Ilara shook her head. "We did it together," she said. "I only followed you because I could not imagine facing it alone." The king smiled then, a full, warm expression that reached his eyes. "Then it is more than survival. It is redemption. For both of us." The days that followed were calm but charged with the promise of renewal. The court recognized the king's strength, the people celebrated his return, and Ilara stood as both partner and equal, her role cemented not by ceremony but by the trials they had endured. And in the quiet moments, when the palace slept and the night was gentle, they would stand together on the balcony, hand in hand, looking at the horizon. There was no longer fear in his eyes, only clarity. There was no longer hesitation in hers, only understanding. The bond that had begun in fear, in the shadow of death, had grown into something stronger, something alive, something enduring. Yet even in triumph, they knew the world held more trials. Shadows might linger at the edges of life. Whispers might echo from the corners of power, and challenges could arise from unexpected quarters. But they faced it all together, bound not by duty alone, but by courage, trust, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that had grown between them. The Alpha King, once a figure of death and legend, now stood fully alive, reshaped not only by resurrection, but by the strength and compassion of the young woman who had bound herself to him. And Alara, once terrified and uncertain, had discovered a power within herself, a strength born of courage, love, and the willingness to face darkness without faltering. Together, they had defied death, shattered betrayal, and reclaimed both life and legacy. And as dawn broke over the kingdom, bathing the palace in gold, they knew that the legend of the Alpha King and his bride would be told for generations, not as a tale of fear, but as a story of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of choice and connection. The shadows were gone, for now. The court was loyal, the city safe, and the curse broken. Yet the bond between Alara and the king remained a living testament to the fact that even in the darkest nights, light could be found, nurtured, and shared. Hand in hand, they faced the rising sun, ready for whatever new challenges the world might bring. Together, always.